Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am here with Sami Khan, who is the co founder and CEO of Nevoya, which is an all electric trucking company. And today we want to talk some misconceptions in EV trucking. So, hi, Sami. Thank you so much for coming on with me today.
Hey, Brielle. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to dive into this with you and your listeners.
Yeah, this is going to be fun. So I know there's so many misconceptions in electric vehicles right now. I mean, everyone has their own conspiracy theories. There's all
Yeah,
like different headlines running around.
absolutely.
But yeah, so I think that it would be fun to get into some of these misconceptions.
Brilliant.
So first, I'll start off with cost. So, given the increasing popularity of electric vehicles, do you think that the initial cost premium compared to, gas is justified in long-term savings, like with fuel efficiency and reduced maintenance costs, compared to how expensive it is to buy one?
Yeah, this is exactly how we think about EVs, and actually, I think it's one of the biggest misconceptions that is holding back the industry from widespread EV adoption, in particular in the commercial space. The problem is people, understandably, they look at the retail price of these assets and they get sticker shock when they see a vehicle that is often, for the case of the Class 8 vehicle, over $500,000. So to put that in perspective, it's at least 150 to 200% more than a brand new diesel vehicle would cost them. And on top of that, when you actually think about it, in the diesel market, you also have the option to buy used. So you can, further discount that price. And that option just doesn't even exist in the EV space today with commercial trucks. So there is an understandable reaction to seeing these prices. And a lot of people are sitting there kind of waiting for the costs to come down before really investing. But we look at this slightly differently, and we've done a lot of analysis, and I mean a lot of analysis, on the total cost of ownership, i.e., how much is this vehicle going to cost you over its entire lifetime? And this is where EVs start to claw some of this disadvantage back and actually start to gain an advantage on traditional ICE vehicles. So again, focusing on the trucking sector, the American Transportation Research Institute, they do an annual analysis of the operational cost of trucking. And what they found is that fuel and maintenance are the two largest operational costs for trucking fleets after drivers. And these are the areas where you can drive huge benefits by switching to EV. Not only are EVs more efficient, so they simply use less energy to get from A to B, that energy is also cheaper to access through the grid and in some cases through renewables. In certain states, going EV can actually reduce your cost of fuel by over 90%. And on the maintenance side, I know everyone has heard the stats that a typical diesel truck will have over 1,000 moving parts, and there are 10 to 20 on an EV. But this then translates to up to 50% lower maintenance costs. So going EV can lead to huge savings on two of the largest cost drivers for fleets. And what you find is the more miles you run, the more that these savings eat into that higher upfront cost. And so really, this isn't a question of what costs more upfront. It's actually a question of utilization. It's about maximizing the number of miles that you can run through your EV, which in turn drives a lower overall cost and allows EVs to compete with diesel on economics. And really, that's what we're tackling in Nevoya. We're figuring out how do you get the utilization levels that are required of an EV truck to actually compete with diesel on a cost basis, as opposed to relying on, people's PR strategies or some green premium to make up the difference in cost.
So my next question or misconception would really be like the charging infrastructure.
It is.
So I know it's expanding rapidly. I mean, we're getting press releases every day about people installing, new EV. I'm seeing it at my local Wawa.
Yeah.
Are there still, I mean, for cars though, are there still significant gaps in availability, particularly like in rural areas or peak hours? And how do you think this is going to evolve in the future?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because it's a chicken and egg problem, right? Who is going to build an EV truck charging station when there are no EV trucks on the road. And it's actually, even more complex for trucks because it's a much, much higher capex bar than it is for a passenger vehicle. And so, and then similarly, who's going to buy an EV truck if you have nowhere to charge it? But thankfully, we have come on a lot in the past few years, and a mixture of private and public funding has really helped to narrow that gap. So in Southern California now, there are an abundance of options for charging an EV truck. There are already over 10 providers in Southern California alone providing charging capacity for EV trucks, which anyone can tap into if you have the vehicles. And we see this growing month on month. In addition, the real sweet spot for EVs is short haul routes. So these tend to be in city areas. They also tend to be daytime routes because you're reliant on things like ports and warehouses being open during their working hours. And so that means that a lot of the use cases that make sense for EVs result in those same vehicles sitting idle at the depot overnight, which is a perfect time to charge. So this actually allows you to do two things. One, you can charge at a much lower rate, which is actually a lot easier to build. It's a lot cheaper. You can get the power availability from the grid much quicker. And you're drawing at a time when the overall grid capacity is much higher because the rest of the world is asleep. And secondly, it can massively reduce your costs as you aren't then reliant on a third party for your charging needs. And that gets back to our initial point of narrowing that gap between the cost of running an EV and the cost of running diesel. So that's why when we think about this, we really think about a two-pronged approach. We're using our own facilities for cheap, slow overnight charging. And then we can partner with some of the third parties I alluded to before who've done really great work in getting some of that high power charging up and running, which allows for opportunity charging during the daytime where you need it to be much faster, you need it to be convenient, you need it to be near your customers. It's exactly the same strategy as most people have with a personal EV, right? You charge at home overnight for 90% of the time at a very low cost. But if you need to get over to your parents in San Francisco, then you'll use the Tesla supercharging network and you'll pay that higher rate in order to do so for the convenience. So that's really where we see the EV trucking market going. As for rural areas, you're right. And frankly speaking, this is going to be an area that takes some time to catch up. But EVs are not a solution for every single use case, right? We've got to focus them on the use cases where they make sense. And right now, that is in cities, in short haul routes, in things like drayage applications or warehouses to distribution centers, those types of routes. So let's get them on the roads, servicing those routes first, and then think about the rest of the market.
Speaking of passenger versus trucks, so there's a lot of, I feel as though EVs in consumers have become pretty much mainstream.
Yep.
Do you think that there's current limitations and future prospects for electric trucks and commercial vehicles in terms of range, payload capacity, and charging infrastructure the way that we have passenger? Because I know we recently got a press release from Love's that they were launching a whole electric or EV charging campaign. And as we dug into it, we realized this is only for passengers.
Yeah.
or passenger vehicles, not for commercial vehicles.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this really speaks to a general issue that the industry is facing at the moment. People look at EV trucks and they think they should be able to replace a diesel truck with an EV truck one-to-one. But that just isn't the case. Maybe in 10 years' time, that will be the case and there'll be, the right range on the vehicles and nationwide charging infrastructure to enable it. But right now, that isn't the right way to think about these vehicles. If you have a fleet that is predominantly long haul, you're moving goods from coast to coast or up and down the country, you should not be buying an EV today. And I'm an EV evangelist, and I'm happy to say that if you're one of those guys, diesel is probably your best bet today, but come back and talk to me in 5-10 years' time. However, 50% of the freight in this country is not long haul. 50% of freight moves under a distance of 250 miles, which incidentally is the range of most of the EVs available in the market today. So these are the use cases that EVs were born to serve. Drayage is the one that people often use as an example. And it's a fantastic use case because drayage trucks tend to cover much fewer miles. But there is also just a lot of freight moving between warehouses and distribution centers or to end customers, which are short haul and can very easily be fulfilled using an EV. So my message here is really that EVs need to be applied to the right use cases. They are not a one-size-fits-all solution, certainly not today. So instead of getting hung up about what they can't do, let's think about what they can do, because there is plenty there to get to work with. So let's focus on those routes and let's start to get these vehicles onto the road. And that then becomes the building blocks that enable the next step in the chain, the long haul trucking, the rural areas, and the other things that we talked about.
I know we talked about, the charging capabilities and the infrastructure, but there's a lot of fear of running out of, battery while on the road, especially, as we talked about, there's, these not as in these rural areas, there's not as many charging stations. So how do you guys address that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And so for us, we think about this in kind of two ways. So firstly, you've got to be monitoring these vehicles 24/7, right? It's not like a diesel where you can just let it go and you know how much diesel it's going to use. And if it uses a little bit more, they can go and fill up and everything is hunky-dory. You really have to manage your operations in a different manner. So for us, for example, we have dashboards up on screen at all times at our operations center that shows all of our vehicles, what the current range is, how quickly they're draining the batteries. And yes, you've got to stay on top of it. And it's more work. But on the flip side, you have other things that we don't need to worry about. We don't need to worry about, as I said before, some of the maintenance issues that you have with diesel or your DEF running out or whatever else it is. So you have to stay on top of these things. You have to look into them. You have to be on top of what the vehicles are doing and where they're going to get to and spot issues before they arise. But then the second thing is, when those issues do arise, what do you do? And it's a really key question, because you can't let your customer down. Right? This industry, if there's anything I've learned since I entered this industry, it's that getting goods to your customer on time is more important than anything. So you have to have contingencies in place and you have to have backup strategies in place that mean that if a vehicle runs out of range or whatever it is, you can still get those goods to those customers. So that's exactly how we think about the operations. We think, firstly, make sure that these vehicles, that you're on top of what these vehicles are doing. You know what the range is, you know where they're likely to get to, and you're spotting any issues before they come up. But secondly, make sure that if an issue does come up, you have the contingencies in place and you have the strategies in place to get those goods back to that customer. And then you can deal with that vehicle, then you can deal with that driver, et cetera, et cetera. But the first and most important thing is getting the goods to your customer on time.
Some people also say that it takes a lot of power to charge these vehicles, that it would, make your a power bill go up higher and whatnot, especially during peak demand. Do you feel that that's true, or is that not true at all?
No, it absolutely is true. It absolutely is true that these vehicles take a hell of a lot of power, especially when you're trying to charge them at the highest rates possible. But again, this is about thinking about the right use cases and it's thinking about the right strategy. So for us, we focused on these short haul use cases, which are during the daytime, which means that we can concentrate our charging overnight. And overnight, you have at least 12 hours where these vehicles are idle. If you're operating a single shift, your driver can only drive 11 hours by law. So you've actually got 13 hours where that vehicle is sitting in a depot and can charge. And if you can charge it for 13 hours, you can charge at a much lower rate. As I said before, you can charge overnight where the strain on the grid is much, much lower. And therefore, the ability to tap into that power is much less limited. The difficulty and the area that, frankly speaking, needs work and needs improvement over the next few years, if we're to increase the market share of EVs, is what do you do when you need a fast charge? What do you do when either the distance that you're covering is too high, so you can't rely on your overnight charging, or if you just need an opportunity top-up charge in the middle of the day and you don't want to leave that vehicle idle? That's when you need this fast charging. But people are already tackling this market. And like I said before, there are already over 10 providers in California who are providing some of that fast charging. So yes, there are hurdles, but people have overcome those hurdles already, and that will only increase. Secondly, when you think about the cost, you actually have to think about optimizing that, and you have to see that as an opportunity, right? You're completely right. You do not want to be charging a commercial EV truck between the hours of 4 to 9 p.m. There is no way you will make money on that. So that then becomes a question of how do you structure your operations? How do you structure your business? How do you structure your routes such that you're not having to tap into charging between 4 to 7 p.m., 4 to 9 p.m., sorry. You are tapping into charging either overnight or during earlier hours where it's much, much cheaper. And that means counterintuitive things. Maybe you go and recharge a vehicle when it still has 70% range left because it's cheaper to do so. And then you don't have to tap into that window when the charging is really, really expensive. So it's a paradigm shift from diesel. With diesel, you know you can go to the pump, you know it's going to cost you what it's going to cost you, you know that doesn't change. It's a real paradigm shift to think about and optimize your operations around these decisions. But that is what is required in order, as I said before, to narrow that cost gap and then to ultimately get EVs to a point where they are not just as cost effective as diesel, but actually cheaper than diesel.
Well, I only have time for one more question. So I want to get to the safety of it all. So as we've seen tons of viral videos with lithium batteries and things like that, people are scared of anything EV or electric bursting into flames. How do you address that?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny, right? The argument that, you know, there's a vehicle that is powered by a battery and electricity, you know, the things that you have all around your house and you use all the time. And that's scarier than a big vehicle that is literally powered by a huge vat of highly combustible fluid, right? Like, you know, just from the outside, it's slightly bonkers. So let's talk about the actual figures. Firstly, one thing I absolutely will not deny is that when an EV catches fire, it is more difficult to deal with. So I'm sure that people saw the news of the Tesla Semi that caught fire last week, and it took, you know, nearly a full day to put it out. So absolutely, when these things do happen, they need to be handled with care and in the proper manner, and that can take time and it can take resources. But petrol and diesel vehicles catch fire 20 times more frequently than EVs. So yes, when an EV catches fire, it is difficult to work with it. But compare that with 19 more fires that you would have had you been running diesel vehicles. And it starts to become clear that it's just not a fair fight. And so people love to publicize these things. People love to talk about, for example, that Tesla Semi last week. But that's because it's just not newsworthy when a diesel truck bursts into flames, because it happens so frequently. So you really have to think about the prevalence of these things and what we're already dealing with, what we've already got used to dealing with, and then compare that with what it means to go electric, rather than taking electric in isolation as this big, scary thing. Yes, there are things that need to be improved. There are things that we need to be aware of, and we shouldn't go in with our eyes closed and say EVs are the safest things in the world and they never have any issues. When things go wrong, we have to be prepared to deal with them. But that is a small price to pay for the fact that we're going to have 19 fewer fires compared to EVs. It's completely worth it.
I think that should be your slogan. I mean, you make such a good point, because I live in a vacation area and there's always traffic going, you know, through my town. And traffic was completely stopped because there was a huge vehicle fire. And it wasn't even a news story. It was just like people rolling their eyes like tourists. Yeah. And then I think about it, I see so many vehicle fires and no one bats an eye. I mean, people are concerned, but it does not have the viral qualities that an EV fire does have.
Right. Exactly. People love clicks.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for, getting into all these misconceptions with me. I think this is a great topic. And I think it's really important that people understand the differences between reality and what the rumors are.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for your time, Brielle. Really, really appreciate it. And yeah, to all the shippers out there, if you want to go EV, just send me an email and we can get things moving for you.
Yeah, I hope to see this a strong future.
Thank you so much, Brielle. Really appreciate the time.
Thank you.